Good morning and welcome to you all. Thank you for joining me for this short session looking at leadership through a systemic lens. Over the next 50 minutes or so, I'll be giving you a brief overview of systemic thinking, trying to make some connections with these ideas and maybe thinking about how they help us to consider the concept of leadership. You'll hopefully go away thoughtful about what this means for your own practice. Okay, so I've just captured a few words often associated with leadership on this next slide. I'd like you to take a few seconds, just take a look, and then I'm only going to give you a few seconds to do it, but just take a quick look at the range of words on there. And then after a few seconds, just post the word that resonates with you most. I'll only give you about 5 seconds, so just go with your first response. Have a look, there may be a word that's not there, but just have a word and just think of one word that resonates with you most when you think about leadership. In the few seconds I've just given you, and the few seconds you spent looking at this collection of words, some will have resonated with you. Thank you for those who are posting. Some will have resonated with you because they fit with the words that you might use when you think about your own leadership, or there might be words that you associate with leadership. There'll also be words that draw your attention, and some will have drawn your attention more than others. So we immediately start to think about resonance. We immediately start to think about the really embodied experience of leadership, and also about differences. So how might we all stand in a different place when we start to think about leadership? And that's when we really introduce ourselves to the way we think systemically about leadership. And thank you. I can see some words popping through on the chat, so I appreciate that. Yeah, motivating responsibility. So it's really interesting to see how these connect with you straight away. Therefore, when we first talk about leadership, we need to think about, is there a common language? Are we all saying the same things? When I look at the different words that are coming through on the chat, then clearly we all have a different resonance when we start to think about what we mean about leadership. So we start to think about multiple meanings and resonance. Everybody on this call has different experiences and perhaps different understandings of this concept. And this will largely be about our own experiences of leadership and being led, but also what we've stepped into when we became leaders or managers. What ideas were we holding about what that means? And so therefore we think about leadership as perhaps being this construction of an identity. And when we start to think about a construction, we also need to think about it being really context bound and able to be more fluid. So it depends on where you sit, and it could be in the organisational system, but also what circumstances draw on you to act into your leadership position. What is it that we're actually being pulled in to do? So we know that if we have an idea of knowing that what leadership means, requires us to really explore meaning and start to think about developing shared understandings. If we accept that, we start to think that the concept of leadership can really only be made sense of between people. So when you think of yourself as a leader, is your understanding, those words that resonate, that word that came to you, is that understood by those around you? Are they the things that you're seen by your team or by whoever's around you as one of the key aspects of leadership and the role that you undertake? So I think about a systemic lens, and what do we mean by that? So just to sort of introduce, for those of you who may be less familiar, the systemic paradigm. And so it's a framework that contains a range of theories and ideas that really move us away from the biological and psychodynamic theory. And that it arose out of this idea that dissatisfaction, I would say, that with the biological and psychodynamic theories, we're really looking inside the person. So when we thought about problems or things that needed to change, it really looked at the answer being within person. And so the systemic ideas and theories moved away from that and started to think about relational functioning. But actually some of the understanding we need to have of how change happens or what problems are need to be located in the context in which relationships are occurring. So we're thinking about the patterns between people. We're thinking about the patterns and those relationships and the system within which they operate. So the idea is that we start to think of any challenges or change being relational and contextual. And when we think about a system, in our context, we're thinking about a system could be a team, it could be a service, or it could be the wider organisation. So it's an invitation to start to think more broadly than looking at the one person as being holder of the issue and problem, but actually what's happening around them, how do they connect to other people, what might be happening in the wider system that might be perpetrating or maintaining what might be the challenge or the request for change. So when we think systems, we're thinking about a way of addressing what Stroh determines as chronic and complex social problems. It's seen as being helpful, that actually trying to locate things in context and understanding whole is a really helpful way to try and make sense of that complexity. That when we're trying to do that, we're looking for patterns. We're looking for stabilizing and organizing patterns, which is argued that whenever you have a complex system, like a team or an organization, there will be patterns that are maintained, partly because they stabilize and partly because what happens between people, that we get into regular dynamics of being around each other. And some of those will be really obvious, overt patterns of behavior. Some will be patterns that are maintained without any explicit attention to them. So this idea that actually when we think systems, we're thinking about there are forces at work all the time, really maintaining, sustaining patterns of behavior and relationships between people. And actually, once we understand those forces, we need to also start to think about what are the forces that might produce change in the system. So it invites us to start to take a more observational stance. So in a sense, you're almost thinking, if you're trying to think systems, how do you become a slightly meta? How do you create space to look into the system and try and work out what is happening? What are the patterns that are going on here? So I'm not sure how easy that is, but I think it's an invitation to start to think from a leadership point of view, how well do we observe the whole system? And how are we able to try and recognise what might be some of the stabilising or organising patterns at play? And are they helpful? Or are they sustaining things that we want to change or need to change? I just want you to take a quick look at this video. This will be fun, trying to move between spaces. But just consider this group of starlings. So what you're seeing is a really interesting and beautiful phenomenon called a murmuration. And so you'll see the patterns that these starlings are moving. So within this group, there are hundreds or possibly thousands of small birds, but all moving in sync and creating these really stunning shapes across the skyline. And they do this because it's a way of them communicating with each other. The research into this has highlighted the fact that actually for every one bird affects the 7 closest neighbours. How do we start to think about how a system, what are the forces at work that make a system change? And actually, if you think about the small microcosms of relationships that can shape a whole system, it invites us to be curious about, well, when we think about our own systems, what would we say? Where are the locus of change? Where are the locus of influence? And how well do we know those? And how familiar are we with how they impact on how our system operates? So there's this idea that Capri and Luisi suggest that the behaviour of every living member of an ecosystem is very much interdependent on the behaviour of other people. So there's an ongoing relationship between the two members, I suppose, of any system. And I suppose we start to then think, if we draw some of these ideas into how we think about teams and team functioning, what does it tell us? What does it help us to do? What does it help us to think about when we're thinking about a team system or a service system or an organisation system? Are we aware? Do we know where these locus of influence or these micro relationships that might be going on? So just to sort of, I suppose, to summarise in a way and give a sense of what system thinking invites us to do, it's really acknowledging that there are often knotty, complex relationships between cause and effect. So it's a very different way of conventional thinking, which tends to look at problem as cause and effect in a linear way. And so in systems thinking, we might be thinking about the part that we may be playing in the problem or in the change that needs to happen. And I suppose from a systems perspective, it starts to say that actually we may be underselling how much influence we have around solving the problem or solving or creating change, that we are, as influential parts of a system, able to really start to use ourselves to influence how change happens. So certainly from a leadership point of view, it's recognising that as you know, in a leadership role or in a management role, you're very much part of the system. And sometimes it can be really hard to really recognise the role that you have. So I suppose it just in a nutshell, really thinking that systems thinking is really trying to encourage us to think about our role as system leaders. And sometimes that can feel like a big heavy title, but actually it's this idea that within systems thinking, you have far more capacity to be able to influence what happens in the system that we may recognise. And so the idea within systems thinking that actually if we're able to take that observational position, we're able to understand where the locus of influence needs to be brought to bear, then actually just a few coordinated changes that can be sustained over time can create larger system change, rather than, I suppose, what conventional thinking encourages us to do, which is perhaps tackle a number of independent issues simultaneously. So that's when we start to think about, what does that mean for practice? What does that mean for how we might think about change and how we are able to influence change in our leadership capacity? I suppose it's worth thinking about what we mean by leadership when we start to think about leadership, actually for this conversation, we're thinking about leadership in the context of organisations. And it's always worth really taking a few minutes to think about what we mean by an organisation. So from a social constructionist point of view, the argument would be that an organisation is a social construct. It's not a solid, observable thing that is immovable, but actually what it is a set of interrelationships, embedded patterns of communication, and an internal system of shared meanings. So because of the dialogue that happens between people, because of the unspoken cultures and behaviours and acts, an organisation begins to create a discourse about itself. And as part of that, it will have a discourse which is about leadership and hierarchies. And it's that discourse, that organisational discourse about leadership, which contributes to the leadership identity that you're holding. So the idea is that actually the organisation and how it functions, an important thing to understand, well, what is this leadership identity I'm holding, is to make sense of the environment you operate in. What is the culture that you're part of? How does change happen to the organisation? So what might be what's being brought to bear on the organisation, which might dictate some of the culture? How does change happen within the organisation? Where does the power to change lie? And then what change happens because of the organisation? And that's often thinking about the relationship with maybe the frontline services, or the impact that being part of the organisation can have with the outside, without there. And the idea is that when we think about that, those are cultural dynamics. There are ideas about being that really fit at organisational level, but can shape themselves. They're ingested as part of how you enact the leadership role. So I suppose when we think of that in a systemic context, it's about understanding the self within an organisational context. And what Huffington suggests is that actually there's this idea of that all of you and all of us will be holding an organisation in mind. And by that, what she means is that there'll be the organisation, the individual in an organisation, but also the organisation will be part of the individual. And so we're enacting the role of leadership influenced by the organisational narrative, which we can't help but absorb. And that might fit with you, that may not, but it's a sense that actually can we really separate ourselves from some of those narratives that are part of the identity of the organisation. When we enact our role as leadership, where are those narratives coming? How are we showing ourselves as being part of this particular organisational system? And so what she would say is actually it's really difficult to separate out the two. And sometimes we need to be curious about what organisation are we holding in mind and how is that influencing how we enact the role of leadership. So the paradigm itself, from a systemic perspective, really encourage us to think about three big areas, really, when we think about leadership: identity, functioning, so how do we enact that leadership role, and then what's our relationship to change? How are we thinking about change, and how do we influence change in that leadership role? And I think, just to sort of reiterate, really, when we're thinking or we're standing from a systemic viewpoint, we're thinking about relational functioning, and we're thinking about the context in which those relations occur. So we're really curious, and I suppose my invitation is to, when we think about the lens and we play leadership through that systemic paradigm, we're thinking about what are the patterns of connections between people and how are they contributing to how the system operates as a whole. So just to summarise, in terms of thinking about leadership from a theoretical framework point of view, if we're engaging with systemic ideas and thinking about leadership, essentially we're thinking identity. How is it constructed? What are the personal and professional stories of self that are being held or that you might be holding? And how are they prevailing? How are they continuing on? What is sustaining those ideas of self? What's sustaining that identity? And I suppose the invitation at that point is to think, is there aspects that need to change? So we're curious about that because we're thinking about, is it a helpful identity that we're sitting with, or is there something within that might need to be thought about differently? Culture I've touched on, but when we think about beliefs and values, what are the societal, familial, cultural and political contexts that might be shaping the beliefs and values that you hold as a leader? Where are they coming from, and how are they influencing how you act into your leadership role? And I suppose sometimes it's often, given the way in which you work, it's very difficult to slow down and think, well, what are my values? How might my values inform the decisions that I make, or what I might prioritise, or how I respond? And absolutely, the point about relationships playing a big part, it's really important, because actually sometimes the challenges that we might face when we're trying to lead change or we're trying to lead and influence a wider system might be that actually there might be conflicts or contradictions between values. There might be differences in beliefs, and how much are we able to slow down to think about, well, what are the values that are being held? Where do they come from? What's contributing to them? What's shaping them? And how important are they? Because there may be things that you're willing to give up, and there may be things that actually are too important to be put to one side. And sometimes that can cause a bit of the tension for thinking about how you behave, but also how others behave in relation to you or around you. Behaviours and actions. So yeah, behaviours and actions, I think it's certainly about, and we'll talk a little bit more about, when we start to use some of the systemic framework to think about, well, what are our behaviours and where do they come from, and what's influenced the actions that we take or the actions of other people. But it's really important to think about positioning when we start to use the framework. So what are the dynamics of power at play? How are we positioning ourselves? How are we being positioned? And how do we position other people? So I'll talk a little bit more as we move through, but certainly these are some of the key aspects of leadership and leadership practice that a systemic lens invites us to be more curious about. So I'm not saying it necessarily provides an actual answer to everything, but it's an interesting way of thinking about the construction of some of these things, the maintenance of some of these held aspects of leadership practice. And then when we're trying to work out where we are and what our way of working is, it can be a useful lens to reflect with. So just to touch on briefly, I know some of you may be familiar with systemic ideas, others not so. So I thought just really briefly, I'll just give some headlines in terms of what are some of these the sort of prevailing theoretical frameworks or theoretical models. And then what I've just narrowed it down to thinking about, well, what does that tell us about the beliefs about change? Because I think it's helpful to then start to think about, well, if we're using a systemic lens to think about our practice, where do we move through these different range of approaches? Which ones resonate with us? Which ones kind of fit much more with our leadership style? Or which ones offer a challenge to our leadership style? So I'll just talk briefly about some of the key theories that sit with them within the framework. So structural ideas. So some of you will know that one of the original architects, I suppose, between systemic practice and psychotherapy was the idea of sort of structural family therapy or structural therapy. And really the interest there around change and how change happens is really about looking at boundaries, hierarchies, and power systems. So actually change happens, or the problems sometimes come about when there's a disruption to structures and hierarchies or a displacement of positions. And so actually change happens when we're thinking about how do we restore functional boundaries? How do we make sure hierarchies are as they should be? That we're really paying attention to alliances and looking at power systems. A strategic approach would invite us to really think that for change to happen, there needs to be some kind of intervention. And that intervention could be at the level of belief. So changing the way that people believe something happens or the belief about something, but also trying to change behavior. So really looking at what is being sustained by this, where's the problem line, what's the relation to communication between different parts of the system, and what's the issue around the recurrence of interaction. So the idea that there's certain behaviors or interactions that are sustaining the problem and they need to be modified with some specific intervention. Then we move into the models around the Milan School, which is starting to think about, well, actually to be able to think about change, you need to understand the function of a problem. And so the idea is that every problem serves a particular function. So if you're standing in that stance, you're thinking that actually the problem has a purpose and it's doing something in the system and it's sustained in the system because actually, and if you make connections within this framework, it's the problem's a stabilizing force. It's maintaining something. It becomes something that keeps the system going. And so actually part of the belief about change is to really be able to bring that change. You need to understand what function the problem's serving. The latter part of that moved on to thinking about, for post-Milan, is that actually we could think of the problem, but the problem being out there and being sustained within that system. But it's almost as though if you're looking to change that problem, you're outside of it. So from a post-Milan point of view, it recognises that if you stand in that systemic approach, you are part of the system. And so actually change happens by looking at the mutual influence that can go on. So there may well be problems being sustained across the system, but actually what relationship or role might the observer be playing because they are part of the system, and how much influence can they have in changing the problem by recognising their place in it. The social constructionist approach really sort of thinks of problems in the level of actually they need to be contextualised. So change happens if we explore context and we start thinking about making new meanings because we've taken context into account. And so we start to think of problems being relational and we start to think of problems being contextual. And rather than being presented with an issue that seems very structured and black and white, we're starting to think, well, actually, if we shifted the context, would it give us a new meaning? Is there opportunity for change if we started to think about what's happened here from a social maintenance of the problem? So how are people talking about the issue? What kind of words are being used? What kind of behaviours are being sustained because of the situational context that somebody's in? Narrative approach really extends that to start to think about the story of self, the story around the problem. So really trying to think that actually it's a construction And so therefore, in order to change happens because you start to create a distance between the problem and the individual. And so therefore, you've got the opportunity to separate their person from the problem, because you started to see the problem as something that's been sustained by much more than just that individual, that there are other things at play here. There's a relationship, there's a context, there are other dynamics of force. And actually, we need to think beyond that individual presentation of an issue to be able to really understand what's going on, and then to start to think about different opportunities for change. And then solution focus is really a stance where it's about trying to imagine a problem-free future. So starting to kind of think beyond the actual challenges now and imagine what the future looks like, and then be able to say, well, what steps need to be taken to get there? So really standing from a sort of solution-orientated, positive stance, and not focusing on the difficulties and the challenges, but really trying to dial up the positive opportunities, looking for signs of change, looking for signs of ability rather than inability. So just, I mean, it's a really quick whiz through, and there's a lot underneath a lot of these approaches, but just to kind of set a context that when we start to interface with these approaches, it tells us something about how we might think about the relationship between these ideas and frameworks, and then where they take us in our leadership practice. So how might we take some of these approaches and the beliefs about change, and how might that inform how we undertake our leadership role? So in a sense, it's using them as a sort of filter to say, actually, if I stood in a place where I accepted the idea that everything is a construction, and it's a social construction, so it's maintained through the way we communicate together about it, then it invites me to think about how I then use those ideas to have different conversations with people, or I use those ideas to think differently about what I think I'm seeing in front of me. Is it a real solid, am I holding those things tentatively because they're socially constructed, or do I believe they're quite certain, which might take me back to sort of a more structural position where there's a problem, it's concrete, it needs to be changed by moving these pieces of the puzzle around. So what does that then mean for how we might take some of those ideas and think about, I suppose, apply them within our context? So from a structural perspective, if we were thinking about bringing about change, we would be concerned with, well, how do we explore structures? What are the systems and subsystems? What's going on? What are the hierarchies at work here? And we might be curious about how a system is organised and led. So it might invite us to be a bit curious about structures and what is happening. And that might be looking outwards. It might be looking within teams, or within services, or within service users, for example. Or it could be thinking about where we are located. What do structural ideas help us to think about, if that's a way of working that resonates with us? So how is our system that we're leading being organised and led? What are the hierarchies? What are the subsystems? A strategic stance would invite us to be curious about patterns of communication and interaction that are being observed. So it puts you in a sort of observer position, and you start to think about what you've noticed, what you're seeing is contributing to the issues and challenges. And actually, to bring about change requires some kind of leadership intervention. So this is very much a more sort of aligns with sort of directive ways of working, directive ways of being. So it does, change does not happen unless there's some leadership intervention. If we applied the Milan stance, then we'd be curious about what beliefs are being held by members of this system. So if we apply it to a team, what are the beliefs that are being maintained? It could be about who they are. The beliefs could be about who they're working with. It could be about the team as a whole, or the service as a whole. And how are these being maintained? And so if we're thinking about system functioning, we might be curious about what is maintaining, particularly if they're unhelpful beliefs, what is maintaining those beliefs, and how can that be disrupted if it's not helpful? From a social constructionist point of view, we might be thinking about dominant discourses. How are they wider societal discourses? It could be about gender, race, ability, for example. How are they influencing the person and the organisational system and functioning? Again, if there are challenges, how do we start to think about the context for those issues and challenges? So we start to lift the thinking a bit more to make meaning and give us a different way of thinking about the problem. So does it open up new opportunities, new types of conversations that can be had? And then finally, the narrative stance. So we may be curious about the stories that members of the system tell about themselves or they tell of each other. What stories have been or continue to be maintained. And then we might be curious about some of the intergenerational nature of it. So when we think about families, we're very much curious about what stories are maintained across generations. But they might be stories from an organisation system point of view that have a history to them. So not necessarily in the way we describe an intergenerational picture for a family, but we may be thinking about what stories that continue to be maintained even though people have left or moved on, or the system is reorganised or restructured. There may be stories that are being maintained. Why are they being maintained? And who's telling the story? And are they stories of helpfulness or stories of unhelpfulness? And part of the stance in that paradigm would be, well, how can we disrupt those or create new stories so that we can start to think differently or change the culture or change the way in which people feel they are part of a system? And I suppose it's thinking about how those ideas connect and resonate with leadership practice. And I suppose there are two aspects, I suppose, should really draw from a systemic approach, really. One is this idea that there's something called first order change and something called second order change. And some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not. So with first order change, we're talking about change that happens in an immediate relationship. So that may be the impact of somebody leaving, a person leaving, or it could be a change in a relationship that you're having with a direct report or someone who's you're supervising. So that would be a first order change. So work has gone on and change has happened, and it's happened in that immediate relationship. Second order change is where change then happens across the system. So it could be a fundamental change to the wider relationships. It could be a real shift, I suppose, to the system, a seismic shift to the system that is lasting and continues on. And actually, when we come to second order change, sometimes a first order change, for example, if someone significant leaves, can create a second order change, so something in the wider system. So we sometimes hold second order changes they can be novel, they can be unexpected. And so sometimes it's thinking about, if change were to happen, how do you, depending on what's needed, so depending on reflections of what's needed, how do you contribute to first order change? How might you as a leader contribute to first order change? So that might be about the direct relationship with a colleague, a direct report, a manager, or how might you contribute to second order change? And that might be where you're thinking much more system. What's your influence across the service, across the organisation? And I think, just the questions come up about second order change. It can be about beliefs and understanding. And that can be sometimes complex to kind of impact on. But yeah, absolutely, second order change can be about an actual fundamental shift in beliefs and fundamental shift in understanding, but it's experienced across the system. So back to the Starlings. So one of the things that we need to think about is that, when we think of those patterns and the swirling and the control that happens when you've got thousands of small birds and one small part of the system affecting microsystems, affecting the wider shape of it, there is something about how we think about the optimal. So when we saw those murmurations, we're talking about that's an optimal balance between individual effort and group cohesiveness. And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about when we think about leadership and what kind of role leaders play. Because in a sense, to bring about really positive impact and really positive outcomes, there is something about the effort you're able to make as a leader and the contribution you make to that. But there's something about the balance of the group and everyone else in the system. And how does that, how do we achieve those optimal positions? where you find that fine balance between how you're able to bring yourself into that space and influence, but also there is a impact across the wider system in a cohesive, meaningful way. So we start to think about how you use yourself. And so this idea within systemic practice is really about self-reflexivity. I'm assuming many of you will have come across that before, but I'll just touch on it as a concept if you haven't. So really self-reflexivity is this idea that it's important how we think from a leadership point of view, how we use ourselves. And the invitation within a systemic paradigm is that we need to try as much as possible and be self-reflexive. So really being able to liaise with ourselves and think about how we are contributing to change in the moment. So it's seen as a very internal process, and really being able that starts with a sense of being able to know yourself and discover yourself in relation to other people. So there's something about quite a self-observer. So you're watching, you're becoming more attentive to what happens to you in particular moments, what's happening for you in the interaction with other people. The next level of that is really thinking about, well, why does that happen and what's contributing to that from your own particular context, your history of self, your story of self. So really starting to think the knowingness is coming not just from what's happening in the immediate moment, but what do you know about yourself in terms of your story? What's led you to where you are? What is feeding into how you respond in that moment? So it's an idea of really dialing up. If we're thinking systemic lens on leadership, it's the idea that for leaders, it's really important to dial up that self-awareness, because then we know we can think more consciously about how we deploy ourselves. We maintain a process of interrogating and observing our thoughts, our views, our assumptions, and our judgments, and our reactions. And I think we're talking about the sort of felt reactions as well as what we cognitively feel. And so it's about this idea that we are relational about it. So we're not just self-reflexive, but we're relationally reflexive. So we're starting to think about our response with other people, and that we can use our response and our knowingness to be able to influence purposefully. So the use of self is quite a key concept when we think about systemic practice, that we know ourselves enough to think, how do we deploy ourselves to encourage, influence, shape change? The ways in which we, with that knowingness and with the sort of sense of what's feeding into who we are, there are things that I suppose when we look at systemic lens, we start to think about, well, what do we need to make sure we dial up when we're thinking about our practice from a systemic perspective? So many of you will be aware of the social graces. If you're not, it's an acronym for a range of contextual levels of context that John Burnham, who was the architect of it, suggests that it's a really useful way of us thinking about context. So it's a way of, when we apply it to leadership, it's thinking about our role and our context as professionals, and really thinking about these identities and how they influence our position and our stance we take, our response to other people, and how we think other people are responding to us. And so it's the idea that these big headline contexts are the things that shape who we are, how we see ourselves, but also the beliefs that we might hold about ourselves and others. And so it's this idea that once we start to think about that, and here is just some of the range of the context, I suppose, or levels of context that actually inform the social graces. And they don't have to be there may be others that people think about. But the idea is that once we use this lens, it can sometimes help us to think reflexively about where we're positioned or what's impacting on that particular situation we're dealing with. But also, how do we see other people? What's influencing the dynamics of the conversation? And if we thought about it through the lens of class or education or employment, we start to think about differences and how are we paying attention and naming differences in order to be able to have a different, meaningful conversation. Another idea that's a really useful one to think about is what we call coordinated management of meaning, or CMM. In a nutshell, because it's quite a complex idea, if we had time, I could do a whole day on CMM, but it's something that really talks about meaning making And actually, this idea that meaning and how we make meaning together as a social act is embedded in different contextual levels. So if you think about the social graces from before, any of those contextual levels, with CMM is that actually what might be a level at which meaning can be made. And sometimes it's about inviting a conversation that addresses where difference lies and also what that difference is doing for the interaction or the way we understand each other. So the invitation bid using CMM is to look for the highest organising context in relation to a particular situation or dilemma. And the belief is by understanding the highest organising context, so what's really driving the meaning making there, and then it allows new understandings to come out. It might mean that we might be able to shift something and change meaning by really paying attention to what's the organising context. So what context, and so I suppose from a leadership point of view, what context is influencing decision making? So just to give you a sense of the levels of context, is that, what is said as the speech act will sit within a whole range of levels of context. So making sense of that in that particular moment, so the behaviour that's happening in front of us and the episode, so actually going on for that behaviour and that act to happen, sometimes we need to think about, well, what are the scripts going on? So we might lift it to the level of the family script and say, actually, or the organisational script, to say, actually, if we looked at the organising context, so it could be a script which is about risk, it could be a script that's about performance, it could be a script around failure or any of those things. You think about that, it's once we lift it to the script, for example, we start to think, oh, actually, well, what does that then mean for what we've just observed? How can we make sense of what we've observed as the behaviour? Do we have to think about the highest organising context? It could be the pressure that's being felt as part of the organisational script is informing the way in which that behaviour is showing itself, or is informing the way in which the conversation takes place. So once we start to think, is that's the highest organising context, what does that open up for us to say, right, okay, let's try and make sense of what is actually going on here. If we know that pressure is coming here, so that means that someone's responded, behaved in a particular way that they may not really have wanted to, but they've been driven by a higher organising context, which means I just need to get this done. So this way that's not helpful to the relationship. Okay, another idea that's useful to think about, appreciative inquiry, which really is about trying to use a model to unearth positive stories. So really, if you're thinking of a team where you might have a lot of problem-laden talk, conversation that's very difficult for people to move beyond, then appreciative inquiry it's a framework and a model or to invite positive stories or appreciative stories. It's trying to shift perhaps to think about change, but really recognising what works well or what's going well and start to be positive. You work through the cycle, and it's a 5-cycle model. We won't have time to cover it in a lot of detail, but the idea is that you start to really have a clear sense of what is the positive change that we're looking for, or what is the issue that we want to explore. And then you work through the cycle, trying to really draw out from an appreciative point of view, what is there that's good, like how do we get there, and then how will we know when we've got there. This Maturana's concept of domains, and the idea that we start to think from a leadership point of view, how do we enact our leadership behaviour? And so the domains model really thinks about, as a leader, you'll be acting into 3 different domains, really. One, which is the domain of production, was where you're really focused on a task or action. It needs to be done. It has to be done. Just get on and do it. The domain of explanation is really about the conversation or the exploration of the why behind the action. Why does it need to be done? Are there other ways to do it? But it may be that in the immediate, because it might be about safeguarding, it could be about some kind of urgent pressing, and not have time to explore the options and the different ways of taking forward that action. But But when you're in the domain of explanation, you're trying to look at multiple perspectives and different ways of responding and thinking about what are the different actions or the choices that need to be made. And the domain of aesthetics is really about how that action is performed. And that one really intersects with leadership style. So the action may need to be determined. So you might be in the domain of production, but actually the way you respond and the way you take forward the action might be reflected in the aesthetics, how the action is performed, what's the style, what's the approach, and what's the intention behind it. And the idea is that actually you may be moving between, I suppose the model invites you to be really conscious of when you are in the domain of production and you're actually perhaps wanting to be much more in the domain of explanation. So you might have to act and then maybe move into the domain of explanation afterwards, depending on the urgency or the requirement to move forward with something. But the approach itself suggests that it's really helpful is from a leadership perspective, we're much more conscious of when we are, which domain we're in, and how we are moving between domains, and particularly around the aesthetics, which as I said really connects with our leadership style. How are we performing that action? What are we bringing in terms of our style and approach? And finally, just to touch quickly on positioning theory. This is a social constructionist approach which really emerged in the 80s. And so Ron Murray talked about the fact that it's really important to think about how you're positioned, and this idea that not everyone in a social episode, so when you're interacting with somebody else, has equal rights or equal access to rights and the duties to perform particular kinds of actions. So there's something about thinking about what position you're occupying at the point of a situation, or what they call here a storyline. So when something's being played out, so the storyline really touches on what is the narrative being played out. If you imagine a play, what's being played out in front of you? What's actually happening here? Positioning is about what roles are being performed by who. So in relation to that storyline, who's being positioned where and by whom? And then by looking at those two things, the actual acts, which are these sort of behaviours, are given meaning. So there's always a relationship between the act itself, so what's actually being done, the actions being taken, and then a relationship to the whole piece, the story, the narrative that's really informed by perhaps the wider system, the wider context for that particular action or activity. But then positioning is about, well, where are you? Who are the performers in it, and what position are they being given? And I suppose one of the interesting things they talk about in positioning theory is the idea that people often use words and wider discourses to locate themselves and locate other people. So sometimes the way in which we're positioned in relation to the wider storyline or the wider narrative, what is actually happening, can be perpetrated or maintained by the words that we use or the words that other people use. So it's not just about the physical positioning, but it's also about the words and the language and how people are positioned in different ways. And I suppose this approach is really identified as a reflective tool to be able to understand, well, if we recognise there's a wider grand narrative going on here, and actually the language of positioning and where people are positioned is being held and maintained by that narrative, how can that be disrupted? What can be an alternative narrative? Or how do I move out of that position and contribute differently to the storyline? Or how do I shape the actual meaning being made of the act? Because I recognise where I've been positioned, or I recognise where I'm positioning other people. How might I do that differently? So I appreciate a great number of ideas, and I think there's probably real opportunity to explore some of those much more concretely when we think about how we embed them in our leadership practice. And so I suppose today was really just a quick touch or a flavour of some of the emerging ideas for leadership practice that really have sat for a long time within the systemic paradigm. And when we start to look at those, we can really think creatively about what do they mean for our practice. And if we really, there may be some that resonate a bit more than others. And going back to that early sort of look at the words that stick with us, there'll be also ideas within systemic paradigm that really connect with us more or not. And I think overarching all of this is the idea that we start to, the big takeaway is really when we start to think that if we're looking at leadership through a systemic lens, we are opening up the possibility to be much more reflective and reflexive about our practice, that we are picking up on some of these golden threads, which are, as I started in the beginning, the relationships, that we are thinking relationships. We're thinking about context and wider systems. So whenever we're confronted with some challenges in our leadership, we're really thinking, oh, context, wider system. How is that contributing to what I'm seeing in front of me now? We're really thinking about our relationship to change and what stance are we taking? What's our belief about change? And how do we stand in a space where we're able to bring about change by influencing others, but also contributing directly if that's the case, but really starting to think about, well, what is our ideas about change and what's our relationship to it, and how does that filter through the system or the organisation that we're contributing to. Working with difference is a thread that runs throughout, so whichever stance you take, it's a key part of that. And there's something about how we are more comfortable with feedback. So essentially, common to all the different approaches is working with feedback and communication. So it becomes a fundamental part of how we shift and change or bring out the best in other people, that we're really zooming in on communication. What's happening? What are we observing? How do we communicate? How are we making meaning between ourselves and other people? And we can't forget the power. And so I think, a real thread that runs through what systemic lens on leadership is power. How is that constructed? How is it being sustained, maintained? What language? How is power being languaged? Or what's the invisible nature of power? And what role do we play? What role or ability do we have to deconstruct some of that? And then finally, I think one of the important parts is about observational practice. So shape your leadership practice, there is something about the observation. And I think a big part of that is thinking about your self-observation and how do you create situations where you're able to observe yourself. You're able to learn more about these ideas of self, the way in which you enact your leadership, where some of your ideas, beliefs and values come from. All of those are thinking about the self and being much more self-observational. But also, how do you then use that practice to support other people to be more self-observational? So how do you use your influence to create that in your team system or your service system? So got a couple of minutes if there are any particular questions. I think it's a lot to kind of move through in a very short space of time. And I think as I was reflecting on, the idea is just to start to dial up, how do we start to think about systemic approach. So there's a point about transactional analysis. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting approach to connect with. I think it'd be really that could be a really interesting session itself to think about how transactional analysis works. I think there are a number of other models that I think would really think about how that interaction between people and how we start to think quite reflectively about that. Communication seems to be, all of this is fundamental to how we might do that. I know it's a huge amount to try and get through in a short space of time, but hopefully there's been something for some of you to take away and really think about. How do you move someone you've positioned in a particular space to a new space? It depends what you mean by the space. I think firstly it will be interrogating, well, how have they been positioned and why have they been positioned? So is it, if they've been positioned because of how you see them and perceive them, is it your internal position of them? And how do you interrogate that to be able to think differently? So what story of that person do you need to look beyond and start to look at a different narrative for? So you might want to change how you position them by being curious about what else are you missing by positioning that person. That might give you the opportunity to think about, see them in a different light or really notice new information